presentation, more of a conversation really, about Brazil, something that Rafael and I have been talking about doing for a couple weeks. News in Brazil changes every week, every day, so we keep on putting it off, but we figured that week 9 it's time to get it done and see where we are, and I'm sure if we were to meet next week it would be a completely different story. But Rafael is assistant professor of history here at the U, and a specialist especially on the post-World War II period in Brazil. He's working on a project on foreign policy and international relations of Brazil, especially focusing on the 1964 coup and its aftermath. I am Schneider. I'm the director of the Latin America Center here, and I am working on a project right now looking at Brazil and India, and I see some of the folks who've taken my Brazil and India political economy class here. And we're just going to present what we view as sort of the current events,
the political ideological front. That was augmented by mid-year 2014, but especially after the election of October 2014, when the gentleman on the right there, Aécio Neves, from the main opposition party, Cardoso's party, PSDB, he refused to accept the legitimacy of that election. From right after the second round of the election, the late of the month of October, he asked for a recount, and he kept denouncing the legitimacy of the election. He went to the Supreme Court, he went to the electoral court, and from that on he lost all those claims, and he started calling people to take to the streets to demand the removal from power of Dilma Rousseff through impeachment, to some other legal procedures such as the annulment of the election. So this gave a really justification and fed into this way more extreme right movements that really start taking to the streets in Brazil, as well as taking into the political sphere. The political representation of a much more conservative right, sometimes with a significant representation of some Brazilian version of a Christian right, that really not only espoused the revival of the traditional 1990s neoliberal agenda, but also a moral conservative agenda, sort of diversity, anti-human rights, anti-race-based policies or gender equality, and also borderline anti-racist and militaristic policy. They became this cohort of evangelical Christian right, along with some other members of conservative parties in Congress. They augmented their representation in that year's election, presidential and congressional elections. So in that sense, they start really being able to control the political process and much of the political debate, bringing the entire conversation, I should use the right, all the way more to the right, my right. And that was the quintessentially demonstrated when this gentleman assumed the speakership of the House, the lower house of Congress, in January 2015. That's Eduardo Cunha, the Speaker of the House. Much of this agenda that they wanted to promote was, again, very conservative, sometimes borderline racist and militaristic, but it was veiled under the basis of combating corruption. The corruption, of course, very selectively defined. It was a corruption promoted by the Workers' Party almost exclusively. Of course, forgetting very easily that he himself is now actually removed from the speakership on the basis of corruption charges, tax evasion, and other crimes, but the conversation that they were able to put in Congress, in the political debate, and also with another sector, with another very important actor in this process here, which is the media, was that we need to clean the country of corruption. Dilma is the quintessential representation. Dilma's government and the Workers' Party government is the quintessential representation of the corruption in the country, and basically we have to remove her, and we have to, sometimes people even espousing to make the Workers' Party illegal. They could not even run for elections anymore, and that would clean the house, would clean the country of the widespread corruption. So it was a very much of a conservative rise of this agenda, anti-Workers' Party and sort of more social policies agenda, and the media really went on board, especially the global corporation, but basically widespread newspapers and other media channels, that really got excited about this possibility for one to really, weaken, if not even remove the Workers' Party from government, with whom they had sort of had deals and some compromises, but basically they were excited about eliminating them from being a viable political force in the country to reinstate again the 1990s neoliberal agenda of pro-big business investments, public investments, opening a lot of sectors of the economy, smaller size of the Brazilian state, but also because the Workers' Party had and not since for a long time, but for a while considering passing some sort of laws that would regulate, would attack some of the oligopolistic nature of the Brazilian media in the country, that really is concentrated basically around, in the hands of 6 or 7 or 8 big families. And there was a conversation about trying to pass some law to, distribute to favor alternative medias and to prohibit, cross ownership of media in some places, similar to what used to be more present in this country. But of course, those media conglomerates were very much against that, and they used this momentum against, align themselves even with Eduardo Cunha here in the picture to be able to, again, weaken the Workers' Party. That became even more prominent more recently in the last sort of year when the judiciary, the other front, so the economic, the political, ideological, cultural, and the judicial front, became a key actor in Brazilian politics. And that was not the case for a long time, or probably ever. The level of judicialization of the Brazilian politics. The judiciary became really involved as a key actor in deciding what can be done, what kind of, who is allowed to play the political game anymore. And then that's where some of the analysts sort of disagree. Some people are more hopeful that the judiciary may play a more constructive role in punishing, similar to what happened in Italy in the 90s, I believe, right? Cleaning the house of corruption. But I'm way more skeptical. I think the way that these investigations in the judicial investigations have been conducted, all the way from lower court judges all the way to the Supreme Court, has really been, not, I wouldn't say targeted, but mostly impacting the Workers' Party, what indeed there is a lot of corruption. But when you look at who is really being tried and whose processes of investigation really, are followed through, usually happens to be people in the Workers' Party, while other people throughout the political system, including Schneider, as we saw the picture before, has basically been protected along with other parties of the PSDB party. And so much of this judicial proceedings have been promoted by this gentleman here, Sérgio Moro, a federal court judge, lower court federal judge. And of course, that is a fantastic picture of people, we are with you, we stand with you, that I found on the internet, and that's a lot of people that were supporting impeachment, portray this picture and really praising Moro as the savior of the country, which is another negative side of this whole thing, which is this idea that we need a savior, and the savior will be this judge who will clean everything, right? The judiciary prevented the recent appointment in late March of Lula as the chief of staff of Dilma, and then really when things sped it up even faster, because the idea was that was only to shield him from investigations, because would only, as Minister of State, he would only be able to be tried by the Supreme Court, and they were able to revert that appointment by Dilma in a very sort of controversial, to say the least, if not even illegal decision, but again, a decision that it was espoused by members of the Supreme Court, in that sense, I guess, made legal, that where the president no longer can appoint people to the cabinet, which is what the Constitution of Brazil says, without the approval of the Senate, which is not the case here, right? So it's different in Brazil. So the Workers' Party has a lot of these members in prison, and there's an entire conversation that, and not really to arrest Lula, but to really investigate very harshly. Lula has been brought forcefully to some indictment. And that also, of course, polarized things in the sense of people supporting Lula and the people excited that Lula perhaps would finally go to jail. So all of this combined, including, this gentleman again, Eduardo Cunha's erratic and maniac behavior, I would say, of playing in the speakership position since the beginning, but especially in the last 6, 7, 8 months, threatening to accept the opening of the process of impeachment in the House. That's what has to be done. Unless the Workers' Party would shield them in the Ethics Commission investigation that, is alleged but never goes anywhere, conducting an investigation to suspend his right as a member of the parliament on corruption charges. And the Workers' Party eventually, I think it was way back in November, December, decided that they would support that investigation. That's when Eduardo Cunha said, okay, you crossed the line, so now we will allow the impeachment proceedings to start. And he accepted that eventually to start in He eventually put onto a vote in April, and on April 17th, with 2/3 of the House votes, the impeachment process was allowed to start in the House, and that was sent right away to the Senate. So in the Senate, there was a final vote, or was the vote, it was a commission that opened the process, and then on May 11, which means what, 10 days ago? Is it? No, not even less. Last week, a week ago. 1/3 was needed. 1/3 of the Senate votes to pass the what?
Half.
Was half the needed then?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I thought it was 1/3. That's what I read. Okay, so but it was more than half.
But it was way more.
It was way more than half. Yeah. And it shows. It actually, by the way, that workers, the government believed that in the House and in the Senate they would have more votes than they had. So they're much weaker than they even themselves believed, or allegedly believed they would have in terms of support in both Houses of Congress. So in May 11, the process was allowed to continue, which means she's forcefully, or she has to step down, right? So now she's gone. And again, the charges are on accounting practices that she had done, which yes, indeed, there's a law now that made those kind of practices illegal. She basically did not have funds to pay some social programs, and she transferred funds from public-owned banks to provide those funds until more tax revenue would come in. And when they came in, she got those funds and she repaid back the banks with interest. But that still is an illegal proceeding, which is all the time done by every governor, every president in the history of the country. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but it's always done. But they chose to pinpoint, since they could not find any actual or a more evident corruption charge against Dilma, they really made the case against this, based on this, not only allegation, but actual practice, as a basis for misdemeanor on the part of the president, and now, of course, she had to go. So this is her speech when she had to go last, either Wednesday or Thursday, when she made her speech and she stepped down. Again, this practice now, if people would actually apply the same measure that they applied to Dilma, the vice president would have to probably be impeached because he signed many similar even more allegedly, decisions on this sort of accounting practices while he was in the presidency. Because whenever a president of Brazil has to leave the country, the vice president is the functioning president of the country by law, and he had to sign several times, and he did sign, and he knew what he was signing in terms of those practices as well. And also people claim that 16 of the 23 sitting governors have done similar things in the last year and a half. So, but there's no sign that this kind of impeachments will be followed through by anyone, but it's to be seen. Again, things are changing and changing rapidly, so we'll see what happens. So what we have now is the presidential cabinet on the top there of Michel Temer, right on the top. That's our sitting president and our sitting cabinet of Brazil. And of course, the picture on the bottom there is of Castelo Branco, the first government of the dictatorship in '64. And as you can see in both pictures, you only see old white men, basically, right? Not specifically. So that's what we have now. This cabinet is only white men, powerful, rich, no women, no minority. Brazil is not really minority. Non-white people represented in the cabinet. Many of whom are involved in corruption scandals. Many of whom are, as we speak, right, as ministers with not only corruption charges, but at the Supreme Court now being tried and being investigated by very, very serious corruption charges, and very adamant to pursue a very harsh, anti-social, anti-workers' party traditional platform, economic, social and economic reforms. So, what's the lesson here, or what we see here? I see of course, a very, very sharp case of, as a whole, a conservative backlash, political, but also cultural, ideological in the country. Of course, the Workers' Party had made many mistakes, including serious corruption cases and scandals. In addition to that, it made the mistake, in my view, of not really seeking to reform the embedded political reforms, political structures in the country. He underestimated, the Workers' Party underestimated the conservative nature of Brazilian political system, political parties, and society as a whole, to be honest. Political forces, political structure, which therefore is very much intact. as appalling as it is to me and as disheartening as it is to me as a Brazilian citizen to see how conservative really and how much of an echo this very conservative, not only political, not only economic, but also politically cultural agenda has found resonance throughout society. I'm not saying the entire society, but important segments in society. That it speaks to that, and also therefore to the limits of democracy as we see and we have in Brazil to this point, which was very much a transition to democracy, top-down, implemented by the remaining forces in dictatorship that align with the civilian leadership of the country to create, yes, indeed, a good constitution, but that requires much more deep structural reforms to be put in place for actual consolidation of democracy, which seem to be on the way to really be achieved. So, on that note, there are we have a huge need of many reforms, political reforms, just to mention one. And I don't see the possibility of that in the short term at all. I don't see none of those reforms in sight. I hope to be wrong. The country continues to be deeply polarized, and more so, I see the erosion of what was, for better or for worse, the democratic consensus that we saw in what was called, what's still called, some people are claiming former New Republic, which was this new, democratic institutions that came out of the dictatorship in '84 and eventually in '88. And in a broader sense, of course, it is an ominous trend for the entire region. It's not the only one. It's not the first one. In the last 25 years of democracy in the region, we have seen similar things, and clearly in the case of Honduras and in Paraguay. But I think here we're talking about a whole different situation in the sense of the scale and the importance of the country and what was believed to be by now one of the most established consolidated democracies in the region, and therefore if even there we could see something like this, it is an ominous trend that we have to seriously consider. Thank you.
So Rafael covered, most of the detail and sort of everything that I would want to make sure that we cover. I'm going to add a few other specifics just so that we all have some of those details on hand, and then try to place Brazil and kind of the current events in Brazil in a slightly broader context. And just as far as the specifics, the only thing that I would add to what Rafael mentioned is that there are a couple of things that can happen right now in terms of procedural outcomes and eventualities in coming weeks and months. So Dilma is right now being tried for impeachment by the Senate. That has to go through, or can go up to 6 months, and if she's to be impeached, it would have to take a 2/3 vote in the Senate to impeach her. In which case, Temer, the vice president, would serve out the rest of her term. There are also other possibilities in the near term. One is that there's a case still working its way through the courts to annul the 2014 elections on the basis of some accusations of misuse of campaign funds and things like this, in which case they would have to hold a new election. The Congress could also decide that that this is all just too much of a mess and they want to hold a new election. I think they might need a constitutional amendment. The numbers are there if they decided that's what they wanted to do. But so you could have two scenarios in which there's a new election between now and 2018. You could have a scenario in which Temer serves out the rest of the term that Dilma was elected to. And Temer, by the way, is barred from running in 2018. He said he won't run, and that was perhaps a deal that he was making with folks who weren't sure about supporting the impeachment process that would put him in the presidency. But he's barred for his own campaign finance misdeeds, and he's paid fines for that. But according to Brazilian law, he can't run. So between now and 2018, there's still a lot that can play out in kind of the procedural rules of the Brazilian system. And this is one of the takeaways that I've gotten from this whole process is shenanigans. So if that's the word that sums up the way in which, and it's true of many of our democratic systems, which is that there are procedural rules in place that can allow disloyal oppositions to freeze a legislature so you can't get anything done, to remove a president if the political winds change and you end up with a large majority in the Congress and Senate against the president, they can impeach a president for having an affair. So there are rules, which we of course saw in this country, but there are rules in place in every democracy that can be played around with. And our political elite in Brazil and in many countries are skilled manipulators of those procedures and rules. And so what we're seeing in Brazil, at least at the surface, is the taking advantage of all of these opportunities to really play with the political system. And returning or thinking more in terms of the broader sense of Brazilian democracy and Latin American democracy and the way democracies ought to function, we do think that there's a governing and a representational task that we trust our political elites to engage in which they don't engage in these kinds of procedural maneuvers that freeze governments, that bring down governments, that really damage democracy in the medium and the long term. So those tools are there and they're available. Right now, the political winds in Brazil are blowing such that everybody is taking advantage of every opportunity to play with those kinds of procedural rules. For some, this is a coup. For others, it's perfectly legal, but I don't think anybody would suggest that this is sort of the right way to play democracy. This is shenanigans. This is taking advantage of procedural rules to remove a president, to make the political elite and the society just more distant from each other. There's less representation, there's less governing going on in Brazil because of these kinds of procedural manipulations. And I do want to say, so go down. I do want to say that I was actually quite bullish on Brazil up to recently, even with some of the confusion that was happening, and Rafael was always smirking at me when we would do our presentations together because he was like, the end is near, and I was like, no, I think Brazil's doing okay. And what I have here looks like and I was wrong, by the way, clearly. But what I've shown here is the vote for the Workers' Party by municipality, in which the municipalities are colored according to poverty. And you have the electoral results of the Workers' Party, the PT, and the main opposition, center-right PSDB. And they organized politics in a way that made sense. This is a country with a significant amount of poverty, and it's one of the most unequal countries in the world. And so, if you're going to, engage in democratic politics, you ought to be talking about those very central issues in which you have a left that describes what they would like to do, and you have a right that describes what they would like to do, and people vote, and the vote breaks down in a way that kind of makes sense. And you get a correlation or a correspondence between those left and right positions and the way that the elections, play out. So Brazil looked like it was doing a not terrible job of, at least in the presidential elections, of communicating what were the concerns of society into the political system. And what you see here is, you have the poor municipalities voted for the left and the richer ones voted for the right. That makes some sense in terms of that requirement of some degree of representation. And you have, the center-right party, the PSDB, in 1994 and 1998, winning elections. This was a period of liberalization, of marketization in Brazil, and this was the way in which the PT and the PSDB broke down the electorate. The right was able to win these two elections, and the left then won the next four elections, 2002, 6, 10, and 14. And this is the first round. You saw the numbers that Rafael posted for the second round. The 2014 election was very close. And this also expresses some of what was happening as far as the way in which people in Brazil were understanding left and right at the time. The divisions weren't, the PT wasn't winning a landslide, it was a very close election. I think that was Brazilian democracy working. I think that was the way Brazilian democracy was supposed to express the voters' desires into politics. And it did show up in policy, so if we look at the next slide, I apologize for the small sort of numbers and all this, but what you see is sort of an arcing upwards of the kinds of things that you would expect a center-left government to do. So they increased the social spending, which is the top left figure, in the years that they govern, which kind of starts about halfway in that graph forward. Health expenditure per capita is going up, expenditure per student, education expenditure per capita is going up, the minimum wage is going up. So all of these policies were sort of what people voted for, and you would expect that to be what kind of policies the government would put in place. Also notice that even when the PSDB, which was in government in the 1990s, even when they were in power, social spending was going up, perhaps not as fast as under the Workers' Party, but it was going up. So the needs of Brazilian society were there, and they were recognized across the political system. There was a degree of consensus around what needed to be done in social policy. So, again, for me, if I look at the last 25 years of Brazilian democracy until 9 months ago, it was sort of doing what it was supposed to do as far as debating the policy directions of government, and people were voting, and this was being expressed in governments. There were some things. Let me skip forward to that one up. Right there. No, I'm sorry. Let's get to that one. There were some things that the Workers' Party that coincided with Worker Party government and in 2003 forward, and that is the boom in commodity prices. And so, in part, the Workers' Party was lucky in that the fiscal strategies that they had of encouraging a rise in the living standards of poor and lower middle class people by increasing minimum wage, by spending on social policy, etc., was supported by the inflows that the country was receiving from high commodity prices. And so on the left, one of the things that you'll see is that from 2006 or so forward, the export of commodities, raw materials, food, fuel, ores, and materials surpasses manufactures. So the Brazilian economy, which had, escaped, if you want to call it that low-income, middle-income trap of exporting commodities back in the 1960s and 70s, they were exporting manufacturers. They were moving in the direction of those developed countries that export manufacturers and more processed materials. With the booming commodities and the inability to diversify away from commodities, the Brazilian economy was shifting back in that direction of being a commodity exporter. When commodities crash in 2013, 14, of course this puts a huge amount of fiscal stress on Brazil. But if you flip up, if we flip up, I actually am following a number of folks who argue that Brazil wasn't in yet in a crisis. In fact, there are lots of ways in which Brazil could have survived the commodity crash. But they adopted the kinds of, and this is the Workers' Party and Dilma's government in particular, adopted the kinds of austerity policies that would worsen the slowdowns that the commodity crash was going to trigger. So even before the commodity crash occurs, Dilma engaged in fiscal cuts, in raising of interest rates, in slowing down the economy. In other words, imposing the kinds of cuts that people suggest are required now, well before they were required, and pushing the economy almost into a situation where they have to now adopt a number of these cuts and austerity policies, which will only slow growth and slow development even further. So Brazil put itself in the position, and what some people have suggested, that Brazil solved the problem they didn't have. Meaning they had a small deficit, but nothing that they couldn't deal with. They had tons of reserves. The green line on the left there is the debt. The green line on the left is debt. It went up a little bit after 2014-15, after having fallen steadily since 2003. It's only barely above where it was in 2003. So there's not a debt crisis. The deficit has increased, but if you look at the primary deficit, which is sort of what they spend beyond what they take in, it's only in the slight negative. And in a year where you have a slowdown, a small deficit isn't the worst thing in the world. Can they pay for it? And the answer is yes, they can. If you look at sort of their trade balance, the blue line there goes up and down, and it goes up a lot when commodity prices are high. Now it's down below, but they've got $350 million in reserves. So they have access to international capital markets. They have reserves. They have a small deficit that's something to worry about if it lasts for a long time, but it's not like they have a debt crisis. So they were not in a fiscal situation where they had to impose austerity. And yet they did it even before commodity prices fell. And then when commodity prices fell further and the economy fell farther, now they're in real trouble. In that they can't, if they impose more austerity, as the current government that's coming in suggests they'd like to do, I don't see that promoting growth. And if they had suggested that they were going to pursue some stimulus, which neither the Workers' Party nor this incoming government has suggested that they want to do, it's not clear to me that that can restart growth. So they're in a real problem now. But in many ways, it's a problem of their own making. I don't actually think that they were in this pickle until they adopted austerity too early. I'd like to say a little bit about what the political situation is and why the situation in Brazil kind of played out the way it did. And on the left, we have the percent of the cabinet that the president's party reserves for him or herself. And starting with Lula's first administration, they reserved most of the seats in the cabinet for the Workers' Party. But in order to get votes in Congress, they have to bring in other parties into their coalition. So Lula had 7 allies, and then the 8th that he brought in his second administration, in order to have a majority, getting up to 65% of Congress within his coalition, was the PMDB, the catch-all centrist party that really doesn't have much in the way of ideology, but brings in a lot of, it's the largest party in Congress right now, and it's been the ally to every government that survived in Brazil. So Lula was almost brought down in his first administration when he had a below 50% coalition in Congress. So there was a corruption scandal in Mensalão that he and the Workers' Party got mixed up in, buying votes from people in Congress. If you don't build a big enough coalition by bringing them into your cabinet, then you give them briefcases full of money, I guess, to vote for your bills. So that was a problem. He got caught and almost, was brought down, but he then brings in this catch-all party, gets himself a majority, gets reelected, and Dilma doesn't make the same mistake. They start dropping the amount of cabinet seats that they require for themselves. Dilma 41, then to 33% of the cabinet seats. Keeps those other big parties in their coalition, and they maintain that majority coalition.
Yeah.
Until the PMDB, and this is where the agency of perhaps Dilma didn't manage the coalition as well as she could have. Cunha's manipulation and working himself to the front of the PMDB bench and making himself the head of the Congress and then manipulating the Congress and working the PMDB out of Dilma's coalition. So there was agency involved in this moment, but the tactics that were being used in terms of building up a coalition have been labeled in Brazil coalitional presidency. And when you have a presidential system, as I showed before, where you've got 2 basic blocks that explain where people vote and how people organize their opinions around left and right, but you have a PR, proportional representation system in the legislature, you get what you see on the bottom there, which is this increase in these other parties' representation in Congress. And the current Congress in 2014 is the one with the most different and the largest number of parties scattered in Congress, different parties with representation in Congress, meaning that holding together coalition is as hard as it's ever been. So that coalitional presidency, the thing that was presumed to be required in Brazil, is especially hard right now. And when they start engaging in those shenanigans, then it falls apart. And so it has fallen apart at this level of the political elite. These kinds of coalitions fell apart. The Workers' Party lost some of its presence. The PMDB picked up a little bit on its part. The PSDB is where it is. The far right has been going down over time. That is something to notice. There are many other parties. I wanted to show this, which is one of the pictures that I most like about this process, which is that the way in which the debate around impeachment has boiled out is itself a representation of the way in which Brazilian politics is going. And that is, here you have the slums in the lower half of the picture, and above them on the hills of Rio, you have slums built right up against the hills. At the top, you've got this middle-class apartment building, and the middle-class apartment building shows Fora Dilma out, and the bottom part says Dilma fica, Dilma will stay. And so you have this left-right split in the way that people make sense of the impeachment, and So this is still ever present, still part of Brazilian politics. I want to put this in the context of Latin America more broadly, and think again about sort of cycles of political economy in Latin America. And so in the 1990s, you had across Latin America an adjustment, a turn towards liberalization and marketization across the continent, and this was in response to the debt crisis of the 1980s, and much weakened Latin American countries and governments and economies turned towards marketization strategies in order to adjust. The response to that, and because it entailed a significant social cost, the response to that in a number of places was a turn to the left. And so in 31 elections in 14 countries from 98 to 2014, you have a left or a party that signaled it was going to turn to the left and winning elections. I've got Honduras in parentheses because really it was sort of a liberal party, a traditional center-right party that won, but its president started to move towards the left while in power, although not hugely significantly. A couple of countries didn't have this turn, so it's not like the left turn was the same everywhere, nor was it present in every country, but what you're starting to see now are reversals. And there are electoral reversals. So, in line with a cycle in which, the booming economies of the 2000s have slowed down, commodity prices have crashed, the organizational and partisan decay that goes along with several terms in government is now hitting the left. And the left parties are getting thrown out. And so you have a process in a number of countries in which these left governments and left parties are losing elections. Chile was the first. In some ways, Chile was the first party to have the left turn. Back in 1990, it wasn't much of a left turn, but it was certainly a turn away from the marketization, the neoliberalism of Pinochet. So the transition to democracy happened first, and away from the marketization of Pinochet happened first in Chile, and they had their first right turn too, which was the response to 20 years of that center-left government in Chile in 2010. So Chile kind of signals that the right can actually win elections. And they win in 2010. I probably shouldn't have put Haiti in there because I've got them in the next category. But anyway, Chile wins, the right wins in Chile in 2010, and Argentina in 2015. The Venezuelan legislature turned to the right in 2015. Peru looks like they've got two right-wing candidates running in the runoff, so one of them is going to win, and they're going to turn to the right. So you have this reversal that I think can be traced to all of these elements. The macroeconomic scene of commodity crash, the slowdown in economies, the malaise or the organizational decay of serving several terms in office, and in some cases the right actually got their act together and figured out how to organize a party and run a campaign and win elections. There were non-electoral reversals also. So Haiti in 2004, a coup. In 2011, they manipulated the electoral results to remove one of the candidates in the runoff. Honduras in 2009, a coup. Paraguay in 2012, a legislative coup. And now Brazil in 2016. There were attempted coups, as you know, in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Ecuador. So there were attempts to reverse this left turn in electoral fashion and in non-electoral fashions. And I think the story in Brazil, as Rafael has made clear, is that it falls into that category of a non-electoral reversal of a left victory in election. In terms of the larger scheme of things and what this means, it's extremely troubling for the region and for Brazil and for the region that the right is willing to do this. So they've shown that they can win elections. In Brazil, 94, 98, in these other places, they can win elections. And so when they lose a very close election, it's not okay to act as a disloyal opposition and bring down a government. It's okay to then, to operate in the legislature and to represent the people that voted for you and to demand the kinds of policies that they supported. But it's not okay to bring down government because you lost an election. And so the message for democratic regimes in the region is really problematic. The other larger story is a puzzle for especially the middle-income countries like Brazil, like Chile, Mexico. And that is, how are they going to restart growth? there was a time when it was sufficient for them to depend on these high commodity prices, and in this way to support those social programs that they were pursuing. But the commodity prices have crashed, and that model, which it was unsustainable because it was dependent on international prices to begin with, and it was unsustainable in environmental terms and in social terms in ways that had real costs for the very social movements and bases that the left claimed to represent. So the left does not have a growth solution to the current problem. And the growth solution that they settled on during the 2000s was not a sustainable one. So that's a real problem. The right's growth solution, I don't actually believe is a solution at all, which is moving further austerity. So I don't predict good things for the Brazilian economy following the kinds of policies that the current government is planning to put in place. Those policies have never produced growth in Latin America in 250 years. They produced increases in the share of income that goes to capital in Latin America, but they haven't produced sustainable growth. So I don't see a solution in a macroeconomic sense to the current problem, and I'll leave it there on that optimistic note. I did leave Mexico. Well, they had a right turn and then a farther right turn. But yeah. Anyway, questions or comments?
What's the current position of the U.S. government regarding the suspension and eventual impeachment of the president? As far as I know, only 2 countries in the world have removed the ambassadors to Brazil, El Salvador and Venezuela. So, what's the U.S. policy?
Have you been following it?
Well, I read his formal statement say that they believe the letter of the law has been followed, and so they very sort of shy of saying. So it was sort of we understand that the democratic process has been followed and that kind of thing. But then allegedly, but again, I don't know if this is true, Obama has not called timid yet. I don't know that, but that's just a symbolic act. But it has been sort of quiet and at least procedural. Yeah, we understand the process is ongoing and it's under the democratic constitution and it's been abided by that. And so it's a little frustrating, keep aside. But Uruguay also said it wouldn't work with the current government, and UNASUR had made some statements of questioning the legitimacy of the government. But at least on the personal note of the Secretary General, I'm not sure about if the institution has made a decision yet. The same thing with the OAS. The Secretary General was very critical of the impeachment proceedings, questioned the legitimacy, and what else is there? And I've seen a lot of stuff about commercial suspension of some purchases from Russia, from China. I'm not sure if that's all. We don't have everything yet. We're talking about the last 5 days. So it's really a moving target here. But I'd like to know more. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, and then that'll be. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to go back a little bit the comparison between the coup in '64 and right now, and also considering this description that it seems suggesting a kind of pendular movement going left to right. But at the same time, we are kind of accustomed, and some are quite accustomed to think in the 60s in the frame of the Cold War. So we saw a wave of dictatorships working in that international context that we may, I don't know, overestimate the weight of the Cold War in this right turn, military one. I was wondering, how do you think about now that we are supposed to be far away from the Cold War, how to think about the framing of this turn to the right? Are we facing some sort of heritage from the Cold War, from those formations, or what do you think about that?
Honestly, on a very personal note, I think that's one of the key questions that we have to engage. Not just on a practical sense, I don't know, of quest for democracy in the region, but on an analytical sense. Until a couple of years ago, in class and in my own writing and conception of these things, I I was getting to the point of almost coming to a tentative conclusion that it's impossible to explain that rise of militarism in the 60s and 70s without the Cold War context, and it seems pretty clear. But almost as a way to say that it would be hard to foresee some similar trends since we are no longer in that context, right? And we saw this in this democratic rise. We did not only see economic, this turn to the left or whatever, pink tide or whatever you want to call, in the 2000s, but along with economic growth, but which was not only because of commodity prices. There was a lot of other, I think, domestic growth policies. But that was the time the United States was not paying attention to the region. I mean, essentially, that's what it was. It's almost to conclude, at least tentatively, that the United States is not really paying attention. We Latin Americans tend to do better. But again, now we're in a different context there. We're almost like in a dialectical, third phase there. That now the United States keeps not paying too much attention, despite some conspiracy, arguments that, I'm not convinced that there's any. This turn to the right is domestically grown, and the responsibility and then the political quest to explain it has to be looked inside, first and foremost. Which is not to say, the United States may not have played a role, or groups, people say that some of these movements in Brazil take to the streets, right-wing movements are supported by the Koch brothers and all of that. That may be so. And I know the evangelical right in Brazil has connections with the evangelical right here in the United States, but even in that sense, we're not talking about the same sort of foreign policy of the state of the United States, right? It's way more civil society organizations, which, by the way, is democratic. It's fair. There's no allegations that none of these foreign actors have, determined elections, which then would raise legal questions, But so I think we have to explain this right turn domestically. And okay, if that is the case, if that is where we should look, well, at least part of it has to be explained, at least in the case of Brazil, and I think that may be true in other places, as a conservative backlash. There is a rejection of, again, I think the economic downturn makes it more visible, but there was this resentment already there. There was this opposition to, further social inclusion. Was this opposition of seeing people that don't usually look like you in the airports, don't look like you in the stores, don't look like you, owning a car now, and more, people making more money, becoming actual consumers in the shops and in the restaurants and across the country. And of course, with the ideological, narrative of, this is a bunch of lazy people, don't want to work, they want to just be supported on the welfare state, the state is too big, which we don't have any proof of that being the case in most Latin American countries, if not all. I think the bottom line, we have to look into the essential, conservative race-based perceptions of at least a significant portion of the middle class in Latin America, which still seems to be true. Which again, as a member of, someone who I would like to believe in and more progressive forces, demands this understanding of then how do we actually go about, if it's even possible, that kind of perception of things. I mean, and in that sense, we're fighting still some Cold War, legacies. A lot of this, at least in the case of Brazil, I'm not sure it was the case in Macri. I'm not sure about Macri or Pinheira. But in Brazil, a lot of this opposition demanding on the streets, and we're talking about, a couple millions or a few million people on the streets demanding for Dilma's, and we had the extreme, we want the military back in power and all that. But as a whole, there was this rejection of Bolsa Familia, there was this rejection of social programs, there was, so they continue to believe that that's not right, and this argument that the Workers' Party was really a socialist party in Venezuela supported by Maduro and Chavez. It's like, seriously, do you actually? I thought we were all, done with this. 25 years, 30 years, what is it? The Berlin Wall fell, and we still have some of that. It is not just a caricature. It still plays some role there. It does have some consequence. If not, a majority consequence, but it does play a role there, which is to me is very puzzling and demands further understanding. I don't know how do I answer.
Yeah.
So I'd seen that.
I know Aaron knows this already, but I'm actually going to Rio in a couple weeks for a summer internship, so this is all incredibly relevant and really interesting to me. I was going to ask about kind of the class racialized aspect of the protest, but I feel like you covered that, so I was wondering if you could talk maybe more about that, but also about the role of the media in all of
Yeah.
this, because that seems like it's been really key in how the narrative around the impeachment has been shaped and even seen internationally.
Yeah. Again, I'm very invested in this. So I'm trying to, I think the facts really speaks for themselves, in the sense you can look, don't look at blogs, but just look at, mainstream media pictures of those demonstrations. The color, the pigmentation of people on the streets and different demonstrations is absolutely sharp in contrast. So it speaks for themselves. For whatever that's still relevant. I mean, I know there's some blurred line there, but still it's right there. It's very visible to anyone who wants to pay attention to it. And the media did play a major role. In the Brazilian case, for sure. It reminded me a little bit of seeing the whole Tea Party with Fox News, in that sense, but in a much bigger scale. Because we're talking about global TV, which does not have the audience of Fox News. It has like half of the audience of the Brazilian population that has TV sets, which is overwhelming. It's puzzling. And in the first demonstrations, they were basically putting the entire staff on the streets, come join us here. They were not really broadcasting, they were calling people to the streets, and from that on, they proceed on that note. And other media, vehicles join in along those efforts. So they played a major role for sure. Even in the printed press, which they claim, we have people that say different things here. There's the editorial lines, and even more recently, there were pieces in key newspapers in São Paulo and in Rio. Basically, sometime one day they would ask Dilma to resign because it would be easier for the country, be gracious and be a patriot and resign. Or the next week they would say, well, impeachment is fine and we need it to proceed and bring the country together. It's like, okay. So the media played a major role.
Can you talk about the impact of hosting the Olympics will have on Brazil in August? Because I know the government has spent millions on infrastructure and stadiums, and they've said, it's going to have a huge positive impact on Brazil hosting the games well.
Yeah.
If it's a negative impact, as I expect, will it have any impact on Brazil going forward into the end of 2016 and 2017?
That is a key question, isn't it? We'll see. It's coming up. I don't think we have seen great results from the investments made for the World Cup nor for the Olympics, honestly, right? I think it's very questionable. Even if you don't want to talk about mismanagement of funds, which also happened, for sure. We had the bike lane that just collapsed, right, on the coast of Brazil, which was long, so it's just absurd. But I do think the games will take place. They will make a major effort with the army on the streets if they need to prevent protest, like they usually do with these international gatherings, like Rio '92 or those things. And then what will happen, which to me is very disheartening. Not that I'm against the games, but it will be used by the government as a legitimacy tool, right? Legitimacy propaganda. So I feel personally, as a Brazilian, divided in the sense, I'd like the games to take place, but not in this context. But I think they will take place. If it will be worth it, how it will play out, we'll see. But it's not out of the realm of the possibilities that demonstrations against the games may scale to a point that it will actually be a bad PR situation. We'll see. I don't know. I don't think we know yet.
So it was interesting. I think that if, I don't know, not Alexander Hamilton, if James Madison were here, he'd be very upset about this kind of discussion, because I think that one of the things that comes out, my takeaway from both of your interventions, is that even if you can design a procedural democracy in which you have institutions where we believe that the legitimacy is a function of following institutional processes, even if you can put that into place, it's really never a sufficient condition for actual democratic consolidation, because it requires that there's some kind of shared goodwill on the part of elected officials. So I think that's kind of a comment. I just wanted to make sure that I understood that sort of correctly. The question then becomes, where does that come from? Because that seems to be something that, if you buy kind of political cultural arguments, it changes very slowly. So that would suggest in the near term prospects are not great for true democratic consolidation. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But then the other issue that I kind of wanted to bring up is how it is that we know what the popular will looks like. Because I think that seemingly kind of, I think not just a tacit assumption, but a stated assumption here, is that part of what makes this problematic is the deviation between the gap between popular will and what it would mean to represent the preferences of the people, and then what is being produced by these institutional outcomes. But if you look at the margins for the vote for the impeachment process, if you look at public opinion polling, if you look at people in the streets, like you said, where there's a very clear kind of ethnic dynamic to that, I guess what I'm having a hard time as a person who doesn't know a lot about Brazil is trying to assess what is the actual kind of will of the people here. Is there some center that is not being represented here? Are we seeing vacillation or oscillation between very leftist kind of positions and very rightist kind of positions? In which case, it may be that there is no kind of consensus popular will, and what we're actually seeing is an expression of two very different polarized opinions.
Sure. I think the country is very polarized. I don't think we can, at this point, try to say there is a majority will. I really don't. Which is not to say if you sample them, are you in favor of impeachment, which I think some numbers came out saying that majority, significant majority in favor. But then when you ask, okay, are you happy with Temer as president? He was like 8%. 8. So, and in addition to that, the country is very divided. But and I'm very sympathetic to your claim. So, if institutions are not sufficient, what else do we need, and how do we improve on that? Well, that's the challenge of democracy, isn't it? And that's also why we have elections, in the sense. I mean, it's not a perfect system, but that's. And I don't want to sound like a formalist, right? Defending, but if we don't at least stuck to that procedural, then what? But I share with you in the sense. I mean, how do we have a nice system in place on paper. The Constitution is actually very, interesting, and the process seems fine, but it's clearly in a crisis. So, how can we fix it? And not that there's any sense of agreement on that. That's why I don't see it happening anywhere else, anytime soon. But I'm not sure what the step next is. So please.
Yeah. No, I think I just reiterate what you said about elections. I mean, there is a mechanism to gauge what the will looks like at a certain moment in time in which you decide who's going to be the government, and there's an election. So I don't think impeachments should be, a gauge of popular will. And it's certainly true that the polls suggest that the majority want impeachment, and the protests in favor of impeachment were significantly and consistently larger than the protests against impeachment. But impeachment, I don't think, is like an election. I think impeachment, it's reserved for that procedural process. But then again, congressional deputies, they look out in the streets and they're like, oh, there's a lot of people there asking for impeachment. I'm elected to represent people, so I'll vote for impeachment. So there are gauges of popular opinion, but I don't know if that's the moment at which we should take those sort of referendums or plebiscites on what government you want. I think we have elections for that, and I would stick to those. But your larger point, which is that democracies depend on a certain acceptance of the procedures of elections, and that the government will then represent in its policies, what those elections produce, is something that is weak, clearly. And I would even say it fluctuates over time, even in our democracies, right? So Obama couldn't get anything done for a couple of years because there was this presumption that saying no was the way to represent a certain voice in the public. And so when that happens, it's problematic for the functioning of these kinds of democratic processes. Did you have something that? Oh,
I just wanted to ask kind of. I don't understand the basis. So that you have formal separation of powers. So if you lose the confidence of the coalition that's supporting your government programs in the Congress, you have the opportunity to basically put together a new coalition. It does not occasion the.
It's not like a parliament, right?
Exactly.
Right.
But circumstances like this were exactly what Juan Lins was talking about in the failures of presidential democracy, right? Like this is literally the kind of case he's talking about.
Yeah, for sure. And it was the case that when people realized, and it took a little while and the presidents were doing it, but it took political scientists always behind the curve to figure out that was what was going on, which is that these presidents in Brazil were building coalitions, and they were building supermajority coalitions of 65%, because you never know when one little party is going to kind of flake off, or they maybe decide to vote against you on a certain bill. So you build these massive coalitions, not ideologically contiguous in the sense that it means you just grab whoever you can bring in, and that means you pay them off with the ministry or public works or
It's very costly.
money, unfortunately.
Every vote has to always be renegotiated. And there's always, if that's the logic at work, and it is, to every vote they're going to demand something else, which almost logically has a limit. I mean, there's not enough resources for every vote to be negotiated. So it's, I think we are there. I don't know.
But Colin, I think you've just sketched out an excellent monkey cage post. Juan Lins and the Brazilian crisis.
People have been
Yeah, I mean, I
saying
think-
exactly that.
It's obvious, yeah.
Yeah.
Other observations, questions? Yeah.
I'd be interested, what role do you think gender has played in the shape of this process? I mean,
Yeah. You played a role, for sure. You played a role. I don't think there's any denying you played a role. I don't think I've been asked, actually, I have asked, some people that actually work on gender, scholars, female scholars especially, in the last year or so, is there any good study on this, or someone trying to study these researches? I haven't found anything, which I do think it's a huge issue that has to be studied and explained. I think most people would agree, most common sense people would agree they played a role, and I'm stating that it did play a role, knowing Brazil, and but I don't think, so it is a fact, for sure. I don't think we can deny it. But it's always, what is it, the whistleblower argument, right? No one can talk about it, right? It's always there. There are all the ways people talk about it. So you can't, it's always there. Because, Dilma's approach to everything was always overly charged with, being authoritarian and being unpopular and being weak. And she does come across not very, charismatic for sure. But, it was a very different standard to what, was expected. So, it's there. I don't know if your sense.
No, I think it was. It's also interesting how it's almost like you can't win, because when she first came in, they said, she's a woman, she's not tough enough to take some of the, the economic or the political reforms that are necessary. And then she did some things. In fact, she went farther, like I was saying, in cutbacks than most people even thought was necessary. Yeah. And then people, found other ways of attacking her, but always in which gender was part of it. She can't do this because she's a woman, or she's doing it that way because she's a woman.
Yeah.
Yeah, Colin, did you?
No, I was going to ask a clarification, but you already got it.
Which will be interesting this election here.
Right.
So, Jesse.
Yeah.
I guess I'm not as familiar with this as probably most everybody else in here is, but why is it that the vice president's going after the president in the first place?
How's the card? Is it how's the card? I haven't seen it.
Right. Yeah, it's a power grab, So if he can remove her, then he moves into the presidency.
Are they not of the same party?
No.
Right. So.
No, he and she no. She's Workers' Party. He's the catch-all.
He's that catch-all party. Right.
Which is in government. You're right. He is in government. But now it's there's always a step between the presidency and he and his party. Now it's there. Right. That's the key.
But and one of the scenarios that I mentioned is if they annul the elections, it annuls her election, but also he's on the same ticket, so they're elected together.
It's not
it's not clear
so
that's the case.
So Martin Mages has vented that he can change jurisprudence by splitting the ticket somehow. I don't know
how you do it. But anyway, so it is. Well, there you go. So it's possible.
Shenanigans. That's what it is.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. What was some of the clarification, Colin, that you?
Well, no, just the ways in which you thought it mattered. Did it matter in terms of perceptions, in terms of public opinion? Did it matter in terms of a differential standard of presumed propriety in office, and that therefore she's being that allegations of corruption are sticking to her in a way that they wouldn't necessarily have stuck to a male candidate in that position? That was just what I was trying to do. I mean, it's probably a lot of these things, right? It's hard to parse.
I think it's just that you can't win. Like, no matter what she does, they will find a way to say she did it wrong, But as far as the corruption goes, she's like the only member of the political elite to which corruption accusations haven't stuck. And so when they removed her, and they kind of the parade of people who were voting for her impeachment, you know, they could have done what they did with, you know, I don't know if you remember that Michael Moore scene in the Health movie, where he has all the legislators walking out, and behind them are the dollar amounts that they've received from the pharmaceutical and health companies. You could kind of like have the impeachment voters as they walk up to the dais, you know, the corruption accusations following them across. And she's the only one where there aren't any corruption allegations that have stuck so far. Which is why they're impeaching her for this accounting manipulation and not for corruption.
Is there harm, I mean, if nobody else can, is there an actual harm that's associated with that? Because I've heard economists make arguments like, oh, this is terrible for kind of the financial credibility of the central bank, or, you know, that this is overly inflating kind of the ledgers of state-owned corporations. I mean, but there the harm would be kind of an amorphous financial market harm, I guess. I mean,
Right.
what is the argument that this is a consequential?
I don't see a huge harm.
Yeah.
The argument, I mean, the arguments that there are reputational ones, like you're suggesting, and then also but this isn't what she's being accused of. But if you were to use those funds during an election campaign to kind of cover up an issue that otherwise would be present in the electoral campaign, that would be an issue. But she's being impeached for her 2015 accounts, meaning the post-election accounts, not the 2014 accounts, when she also engaged in the same tricks, but as far as I understand, that's not what they're trying to get her for. So you could make that argument, and that might be part of what's going on. It's also the case that if, you know, this were to create any long-term inability to fund the social programs that were being, you know, covered, because they then owe more back to the, you know, to the lending banks that they can pay, then yeah, there's harm in that you can't pay for your social programs anymore. But to me, this is all sort of an accounting story. Well, then take it from more taxes, you know, or take it from somewhere else. So in my understanding, it's not that the harm is, accounting tricks don't cause harm in and of themselves.
Okay.
Again, it's a huge debate in Brazil, politicized.
All right, well, thanks everybody for sticking around. All of our 100 grad students take some